Game of Thrones' second episode, properly titled The Kingsroad, which is made mostly in bulk of the characters being on the Kingsroad, where this is a continuing story straight after the first episode, and everybody has gone their separate ways, everybody has disbanded and started to continue on their story path. Now, Jon Snow and Ned Stark's story in this episode starts with starting on the Kingsroad and making their separated paths. And before we get into the book story of Jon and Eddard, we have a nice show-only scene where Ned and Jon are parting ways and saying goodbye to one another, and Ned promises the next time that they see each other, he'll talk about his mother to him. And that is a very pivotal moment in the entire story, which is kind of confusing as to why that's a show-only exclusive, why that wasn't in the books. Just because of how pivotal of a moment that is, not for story, but also for character growth. So right after that conversation, they both literally go the exact opposite ways. Jon headed to the Wall, and Eddard headed to King's Landing with Robert and Cersei and them. Now, in Jon's story, they take a brief stop in the woods on the Kingsroad, headed to the Wall, and he is accompanied by Tyrion and, among other blacks of the Black Watch. And basically there's just a little tiny conversation between Jon and Tyrion about books and bastards and the like. And basically it's another conversation about not fitting in and explaining who you want to be in the world. Now, back in Winterfell, we have Catelyn, Robb, and Bran's story, where Bran is now a cripple due to events, and Catelyn is basically just bedside most of the entire episode of the second episode of Game of Thrones. And I guess I should have said, before Jon and Ned took their paths, Jon stopped in and said goodbye to everybody, and he gave Arya a sword that is in shape of a needle. She calls it Needle. He visits Bran to say goodbye and gets lashed out at by Catelyn. And he and Robb hug and part ways as well. Now, Catelyn's story, like I said, she's bedside Bran most of the episode of the Kingsroad, and that's all leading up to somebody randomly putting the barn on fire when Robb is in the midst of explaining she needs to go find some sunlight and go do something. And Robb is the one that notices the fire. But everybody rushes to the barn and nobody realizes that's just a decoy. And there's a guy in Bran's room ready to murder him with a very elongated knife that clearly is not his own. And Catelyn tries her best to protect her son, who is crippled and basically lying there dead, and she puts up basically no avail. She has a couple lacerations on her hands and body, but she basically wasn't going to protect Bran. Thankfully, Bran's direwolf, Summer, is there to save the day, which, one gripe I do have about this episode pertaining to book material and show material, the book delves a lot more into Catelyn's grief of why this happened to Bran, and among all things, why he's there unconscious, and all of the racket is going on, that being the direwolves constantly howling and just everything making her more moody. The show doesn't really explain that very well. The show just explains that Summer was there and randomly attacks the intruder and kills him. And then Catelyn comes to a realization that Summer needs to stay with Bran, his owner. The book does tell that storyline a whole lot better than the show, just because, like I said, prelude to the intruder, Catelyn goes through grief of all of the racket and the direwolves screaming and howling through the night, and all of that has to do with because Bran is lying bedside, basically dying. But the book and the show of this storyline culminates at the end where Catelyn just comes to the terms of Summer needs to be with his owner, that being Bran. Summer is the actual protector of Bran. Now, Catelyn's storyline actually ends with explaining the knife that wounded her was definitely not of the intruder's like, because the intruder is in rags and he's poor as hell, whereas the knife is made of fine Valyrian steel and the likes of, say, King's Landing. So she explains to everybody she needs to go on the path to find Ned and find who actually ordered the hit on her son Bran. And in doing so, she forbids Robb from leaving Winterfell because there always must be a Lord Stark in Winterfell. So the Master of Arms decides to go with her. And that's where Catelyn's storyline ends. Now we get on to the bulk of the episode, which is Ned, Arya, and Sansa, where this is mostly character development, and this is also in part to Arya finding Mycon, who is one of her best friends, and he's a butcher's boy, but she always wants to be a swordsman, so she randomly wants to have sword wooden fights with him just in the fields. And along her storyline of that, now in the book tells all of these storylines a lot better as well. The book starts with Sansa being offered by Joffrey to go for a stroll and to drink wine and the like. Now, this ends up going into the Arya Mycon storyline where they all can join, and this is where we really tell who's the good and bad guys between all of this group. Sansa, Arya, Joffrey, and Mycon. And it's clear as day that Joffrey is just a giant douchebag. He's a bad guy, plain and simple. Throughout the series, he has some redeeming moments, just tiny little quirks, but nowhere near to proclaim him as even morally gray. Joffrey is a bad guy, plain and simple. Now, the difference between Joffrey and Viserys as bad guys, Viserys is poorly written for a bad guy, mainly just because he's always side by side with Daenerys, who is a good person genuinely. Joffrey is accompanied by nothing but bad people in his life. Now, Robert Baratheon, his father, is probably the best character around him, but throughout Joffrey's life, he's been around the likes of Cersei, who is basically pure evil, but not pure evil in the sense of she just likes bad things being done, mainly just pure evil in the sense of power and greed. And Jaime Lannister, who is his uncle, and Jaime is honestly, in my opinion, even up to this point, I wouldn't classify him as a good or even a bad guy. He's just kind of always there to keep the charisma in the story. That way we know the characters and what their personalities are like. Jaime is a very charismatic and funny character, and because of that, he is also likable. Now, he does do a lot of bad shit that can classify him as a bad guy, but he's also super likable. So, in that sense, Jaime Lannister is a morally gray person. And then Joffrey, like I said, this being about him, Joffrey is just pure evil, plain and simple. He's not about power or money or anything. He just likes hurting things and people just to hurt them. It makes him better. It makes him feel more powerful, it makes him feel better about himself. Now, the storyline is Sansa and Joffrey take a stroll in the woods, getting drunk off of wine. They encounter Arya and Mycon having a little wooden sword fight. And this leads to Joffrey showing off his big dick, where he knows Mycon is just a butcher's boy, and he insults him, asking why he's trying to beat up his betrothed's little sister, in which Mycon explains that Arya insisted on playing with him, and Joffrey just has to shove it in his face that he's just a butcher's boy, and because of that, he's going to cut him up a little bit. Now, in doing so, all of this resorts to Arya actually attacking Joffrey, and Joffrey starting to attack Arya back, which technically, I know not a lot of people are going to like this because Joffrey has already been proclaimed as a giant evil person nobody likes. But honestly though, in this sense, Joffrey was just defending himself. I'm just making that clear, simple. Now, because Joffrey started defending himself and starting to attack her, which he does it in such an evil way, but it's still self-defense, no matter how you slice it. Arya's direwolf ends up attacking Joffrey because Arya's direwolf sees he's trying to attack her. And this culminates in Arya and Mycon running away, not with each other. They just kind of separate and run their separate paths. Arya tries to disband from her direwolf to try and save its life. So she throws rocks at it to leave forever and never come back. And her direwolf is gone. Now, it's Ned and his group trying to find Arya. Unfortunately, the Lannister men end up finding Arya first, so Ned rushes back to the king's court. And he talks to his daughter, finds out what's going on. They all talk to his daughter and Joffrey. They both have completely different stories. Of course, Joffrey's is the lie and the more evil one. Arya is not exactly the truth, but it's only because she's not really spitting out the truth quickly enough. Whereas she's just kind of spitting out bits and pieces, and it's really up to Sansa to explain what actually happened. And unfortunately, Sansa's an asshole. She's just another 12-year-old or whatever dumb bitch that just wants to get laid. She just tries to be the neutral one by saying she doesn't remember, it was too chaotic. And this results in the king first just acknowledging they're all just bratty kids, everybody needs discipline, end of story, which is the morally right thing that would need to be done in that situation. Unfortunately, Cersei, being pure evil in the sense of power, explains that Joffrey has scars. He has wounds that will most likely fester into scars that will be permanent, and she insists that the direwolf needs to die, which is very understandable from a mother's perspective. I do understand that. The king says that it needs to be done, so be it. Well, they can't find the direwolf. Cersei begrudgingly suggests we do still have a direwolf, that being Sansa's lady direwolf, who was nowhere in presence of this entire episode until the very end after this quibble. And that is another character development that straight up just makes Cersei pure evil. Yes, she has good motherly intent and instincts in her, but she ultimately is always just pure evil in the sense of power and greed. But still, I would not categorize her as evil as Joffrey. Joffrey's just pure evil for the sake of being evil because it's funny to him. So, at the end of all of this, we have Ned, who refuses to allow a Lannister of Ill Pain to behead the dog. Ned decides to do it himself. Now, book story and show story, this all basically is the same, set aside the show excising the Sansa and Joffrey drinking wine that goes into the Arya Mycon thing. But otherwise, after that, the book and show are basically parallel with each other in the sense of this story. So the small difference between book and show is when Ned explains that the direwolf lady needs to be killed by a Stark rather than a Lannister. In the show, he explains that Lady is of the North, she deserves better, and that's it. But in the book, Ned explains that, but also he explains the very popular, most famous quote of Ned's right from the very beginning of Game of Thrones, of the book and the show, that he who passes the sentence should wield the sword. And after that little event, both book and show, Ned decides to murder Lady, which is straight up murder. Lady was completely innocent in this entire event. The difference, the small difference, in the book, the story ends with Eddard's POV murdering Lady, and then it transitions to Bran's POV, whereas the show, it ultimately does the same, although by show standards, it does it a little better because the imagery of Ned murdering Lady the direwolf also meshing together Bran actually finally waking up. And they culminate both of those events as kind of a cliffhanger for the next episode. Now we have Daenerys, who her storyline is basically most of the episode, she's getting raped by her newly beloved husband, Khal Drogo, and it's not really that Khal Drogo is doing it in a bad way. Yes, how the show portrays it is straight up rape. But in Khal Drogo's way, the Khalasar just do that to all women. Much like Daenerys' partner, I believe it was Jiqui, who explains to her that's the Dothraki way, that's just how Dothraki do it. And she decides to help Daenerys into showing Khal Drogo how to actually love, make love, and find love through lovemaking. And that's basically Daenerys' entire story, is just love and trying to find love with her newly found Khal Drogo. And honestly, I like this storyline in this book and show's story just because this is a storyline that goes straight from a newly beloved husband raping the wife, all the way to Daenerys showing Khal Drogo there's more to fucking than just fucking. You can actually find love in somebody you're doing it with. So I do admire and like the writing of this storyline, albeit in the show especially, it does kind of feel a little ham-fisted because this entire storyline is within one full episode, and the whole episode is not even about Daenerys completely. So Daenerys' lovemaking storyline really is only 10 to maybe 20 minutes in time, but I doubt it. I would say more so about 10 minutes. And within that time frame, we go from her husband raping her to he starts to actually find love in her and towards her. So overall for me, this is still a very well done episode. It's super accurate to the book story, although compared to the first episode, this definitely has a little more quirks and flaws that differentiate from the book's material. So overall for me, Game of Thrones second episode, The Kingsroad, I'll still have to give a strong 9 out of 10. It's a great episode. It still has a lot of the great elements from the first episode where there are scenes that really complement book story that are just show exclusive, but at the same time there are also book story scenes in the episode where they're not exactly the same, or there's literally just shit missing. Example being Arya or Sansa and Joffrey walking through the woods and finding Arya. But also what really holds this episode together so well is just the attention to detail in the writing. Like, for example, a lot of the episode had to do with being on the Kingsroad, Jon and Tyrion's conversation, and then we also have Ned and Robert's conversation, mainly developing their characters in the sense of you're learning more about their past, their friendship, who they bed, who Jon's mother is, which that's going to be a huge implication throughout this entire series, throughout this entire story. So again, overall for me, The Kingsroad episode 2, 9 out of 10. Thank you.